All right. My name is Pia Jordan. I am in the United States of America. I was a broadcast journalist before I taught multimedia journalism at a university in the state of Maryland. And my mother was stationed at Tuskegee Army Air Field from 1943 to 46, where the Tuskegee Airmen were in training. Any questions? Did you get all that? Hello?
Welcome, we did.
Okay. So again, you see this first slide, but I wrote a book 3 years ago called Memories of a Tuskegee Airman Nurse and Her Military Sisters. And it shares the story of the 28 registered nurses who served at Tuskegee Army Air Base during World War II. And again, that's where the pilot cadets, who later became known as the Tuskegee Airmen, they were undergoing pilot training. Now, a lot of times, people want to know, why did I even write this book? Well, of course, one of the nurses was my mother, but I found her scrapbook as an adult. I vaguely remember it as a child, but I saw it. It had pictures of the nurses with the Tuskegee Airmen, and I was like, oh my goodness, here I'm a journalist and I've never done anything, a story or anything about the Tuskegee Airmen nurses who were stationed there. And one thing you have to remember, to be in the Army Nurse Corps at that time, you had to be what we have in our country, a registered nurse. You had to have graduated from nursing school, of course, first. Then you had to be a graduate nurse, a registered nurse. You'd have to have worked in a hospital for at least a couple of years. And so that's when I learned about that. But there was an issue for the nurses as well as for the Tuskegee Airmen. They were born between 1900 and 1930. And here in the United States, and those of you who may not have figured it out, I'm African American, but I'm light skinned. And so my mother, which when you saw that book, that was her picture at the top, she was also light skinned. But she and the airmen, they went into war thinking, you've heard of double V, that by going overseas and fighting, that would help with racism in the United States. So they were advocating for two victories as a result of this war against fascism and racism in the United States. Now, this is how the nurses and the airmen grew up. They grew up under what was called Jim Crow laws. And these were laws and statutes that legalized the segregation of African Americans and European Americans or white Americans. And let me go back on that slide. And the reason why it was called Jim Crow laws, it was taken from this character right here. He was a white actor. And what he would do, he would perform. He wasn't that great an actor initially, but he started taking on a character called Jim Crow. And what he saw an African-American man, I believe it was in New York, who was in tattered clothes and was singing a song called Jump Jim Crow. So after the emancipation of enslaved people here in the United States, that term, Jim Crow, came along, and that went with the idea of Jim Crow laws. And as probably many of you know, here in the United States, African Americans had to drink at certain water fountains. They couldn't try on clothes at shopping centers. They had to maybe walk on one side of the street when a white person was walking the other way. So I just want you to understand the future Tuskegee Airmen and the nurses and anybody who was on the base where they were training, that's what was going on. Now, there was also another issue leading into World War II. After World War I, there was the 1925 Army War College Report, which was the employment of Negro manpower in war. And basically what it said is that African Americans, at that time, Negroes, they lacked intelligence and were cowardly under combat conditions. So this is the thinking by the U.S. Army of African Americans as we're nearing World War II. So what was happening, any African American male at that time, it was basically non-professional. They could be a cook, mechanic, janitor. They could build roads, ditch diggers, unload supplies. As far as professional African Americans, as doctors, lawyers, and nurses, that was a no-no. Keep in mind, we're in the 1930s now. Now, the United States hadn't declared war yet, but we know that Germany invaded Poland, and that was the beginning in 1939, and that was the beginning of World War II. But in the meantime, there were organizations that lobbied to see if they could get African Americans in professional positions. The president at that time said, no, can't do it. Still, there was lobbying to see if it could be done besides non-professional, professional African Americans. So what happened is the president decided, well, we're not going to have pilots trained with white pilots. We'll have them in a separate but equal environment. So an entire Army base was built in Tuskegee Army. It was called Tuskegee Army Flying School in Tuskegee, Alabama. And that was in the South, where Jim Crow laws would have been very strong. So they put this air base there to train the African American pilots, cadets, separately. But when you have an air base, you need people to run it, and you also need a station hospital. And guess what? If you were African American, if you were Black, you could not be in the Army Nurse Corps. So how did any of these professional registered nurses get the opportunity to even go down to Tuskegee and practice their profession? Well, what happened is the American Red Cross was the recruiting arm of the Army Nurse Corps. And of course, if you're Black, you couldn't join the American Red Cross. So this one woman, Della Rainey, she had all the qualifications. They told her she couldn't join. This is 1941. So what she did is she wrote a letter to the head person, letting them know she wanted to serve her country. And as a result, they sent her a membership card. So it was Della Rainey who opened the door for the Army Air Corps at that time. There was no Air Force in the United States. For the Army Air Corps to allow African American women to join the Army Nurse Corps. And after she went in, she was the principal chief nurse there. And these other nurses, when she was promoted, took her place. And here are the rest of the 24 nurses who served at Tuskegee Army Air Field during World War II. Now, as you can see, my mom is kind of in the middle there, Louise Lomax. She was Lieutenant Lomax. And one thing that I have to share, the Tuskegee pilot cadets had no rank at that time when they were in training. But the nurses who went in the Army Nurse Corps went in as a second lieutenant. They were officers. The airmen at that time had no rank. So the airmen had to salute the nurses and treat them as officers. Now, since I know there are many of you from different parts of the world, I wanted to share some things. Once more African-American women, and it was a total of 500 to 600 African-American nurses who served during World War II, out of 59,000 to 60,000 nurses. Now, the nurses at that time could only serve on military bases where they were African Americans or German prisoners. So African American males or those who served on a Negro base, those are the only places the women, the African American nurses, could serve. So you had one group go to England. If you see over there, the women on the left, that was one of the group in England. And their job was to serve German prisoners. And one of my mother's nursing school was St. Philip Hospital School of Nursing. And I know at least one of the nurses there served in England, and her name was Emma Sue Sanford. And she was in the class of 1942 of St. Philip Hospital School of Nursing, which was in the state of Virginia. Now, 3 of the Tuskegee nurses were transferred to Liberia. And Liberia was the world's significant source of natural rubber. So that was needed for military vehicle tires. And they served at what was called Roberts Field. However, as I understand it, all the nurses got malaria. They weren't in a great mood. So eventually they were brought back to the United States. But the English group, the Liberian group, and the Australian, New Guinea, and Philippines group, those were the African-American nurses where they served during World War II. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about this man. He's what's called a documented original Tuskegee Airman, or DOTA. And he was at Tuskegee. His job was to load ammunition on the planes. And I interviewed him several years ago because he lived near me, because I grew up in the state of Maryland in the United States. And he described what he found out about what Black military men experienced in Italy. And he also heard what they experienced in England. And what he told me was they would have candy to give to the Italian children, and I guess the English children too, for those who were over there. And when they gave them the candy, the children would run around them. And he said they were asking the African-American, the Negro pilots, why are these children running around us? And evidently that they had been told that African-American men had tails. So they were going around trying to see if these men, these pilots, and those who were with them actually had tails. Now, another military couple, this was a nurse, Abby Voorhees. Her husband was Mac Ross, and he was in the first graduating class of Tuskegee Airmen. Unfortunately, he was in a non-combat aircraft accident in Italy. And as I understand, his widow was told that he was buried in the U.S. military cemetery in, am I pronouncing this right, Bari, Italy? However, I found in a grave database, he's listed as being buried at the Sicily Rome American Cemetery and Memorial in Lazio, Italy. And this is an excerpt from a historian. When you think about the Tuskegee Airmen, the pilots, the nurses, we're still in a segregated society. But by 1948, the president at that time, Harry Truman, did sign an executive order to desegregate the military. And you have to look at it was like the women, the nurses, the pilots, professional organizations also that helped crack, as she said, it cracked in the edifice of white supremacy that the Black community later poured through. And just to mention, there's a Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site in Tuskegee, Alabama, and there's the Friends of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. They're trying to fundraise at this time for a memorial wall for all the people who served at that base. And it would also include some statues of the pilots and also one nurse. And I want to thank you for allowing me to share this story about the Tuskegee Army nurses.